Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to Views from Ukraine. Today we will be discussing annexation or subjugation, what the referendum really means. On a technical note, please mute your microphones. We will be recording the entire session today. The first 40 minutes will be moderated discussion, and that will be followed by 3 breakout rooms where you will have a chance to have a more in-depth discussion with all 3 of today's panelists. We're very happy to have you here with us today, but of course this is for a very serious reason. And one important note, everything discussed today will be on the record, both the moderated discussion, but also the contents of the breakout rooms. So before we get started, I really wanted to highlight where the US government stands on the referendum. And I wanted to highlight something that our ambassador to the United Nations said just yesterday, because I think it really gets to where we stand. So now let me be clear. The United States will never recognize any territory Russia attempts to seize or allegedly annex as anything other than part of Ukraine. We reject Russia's actions unequivocally, and we will continue to work with our allies, partners, and like-minded to impose costs on Russia and to provide historic amounts of support for Ukraine. Justice demands nothing less. Protecting the UN Charter demands nothing less. And as we've watched these illegal referenda take place in cities where there's very, very low turnout, where many of the residents no longer are even present, and with gross acts of corruption accompanying them, we are even more horrified by Russia's aggressions in Ukraine. So now I would like to introduce our panel for today. We have Natalia Gumenyuk, Ilya Ponomarenko, and Petro Berkovsky. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And I would like to get right into it first with a question for you, Natalia. The so-called referenda have a geopolitical component, but they also have a very real impact on people's lives. Based on what you've seen in liberated territory and heard from sources, what is it like to live under Russian occupation?
I probably should explain from which perspective I'm speaking. As a Ukrainian reporter, I've been closely watching the situation, particularly in the occupied territories in the south of Ukraine since the first days, but also I've been reporting the annexation of Crimea and the occupied Donbass was working since 2014, and that's something I've been in Simferopol and Bakhchisarai in 2014 while so-called sham referendums were taking place. But I think it's very important to understand that about what's going on now, because the Western public, this is one of the major, and first of all, the Western media, they are one of the most important recipients of the Kremlin with this, what we cannot even call, forced or sham referendum. And I'd like to explain, because if we speak about the ones 2014, the European Court for Human Rights really clearly said that it had zero influence on the status of the territory. It's still officially occupied. It has no at all any impact legally. But at that time, I think it was more sophisticated project with a lot of, manipulation, operation, let's say show. Even if it was all kind of fake and staged, it still looked at least a bit like the referendum. If we're speaking now about what's going on in the newly occupied territories, really speak about just some kind of not even an imitation, because there is a difference when there are the occupied soldiers somewhere, occupied forces somewhere near the poles, and the different situation when there are people with the guns knocking at the doors and forcing people to vote, giving a short anecdote. I'm all the time in touch with the people or some kind of friends, colleagues who have relatives in the occupied territories. And one whose soldier, whose son is a soldier, he told to the mother that, like, do whatever you want, put this, yes, if there would be a gun person coming to your house, do, it doesn't matter. Because what we also need to understand that for there were not just usual repressions. We have the cases of people being executed, tortured, killed, just for being not supportive of the of Russia as an occupying power. To be very short and brief, and to my colleagues again, I should also explain that for the last 4 months, especially males, were not allowed, and people allowed to leave the occupied territories. If they wanted to leave, they need to go through this procedure of filtration, which is extremely dangerous, especially to the males. You can be just like a person which is physically fit, you can have a tattoo, or I don't know, you can work for any former Ukrainian office, school, kindergarten, being a firefighter, that's already the risk. And for me, the only real life impact of what's going on is a possible mobilization of the Ukrainian citizens who remain at their territories, which is against Geneva Convention because occupying powers are not allowed to do this. But also in this regard, that would be if these people are not allowed to leave, and if they would be forced, they, as we know from the occupied Donbass so far, with any necessary gear to defend themselves on slaughter. So there is a real life impact to the life, and we yell about that. If that be but that's all the rest. I think it's very important media frame it, because there is one thing when it's something looks like referendum, but this is what's happening now. It's even do not really looks like. It's enough to write down the results. We have new territories of the Kharkiv region. I'm just coming from Izium and Balaklia. There were the documents found by the Ukrainian journalist where, as long as on 24th of August, it was already written the numbers of the people who voted for this referendum. So that's kind of the documents were in the possession of some of the Ukrainian journalists. So we can just imagine these territories were liberated, so we have access to these documents. So it would be quite a similar situation in the rest of the territories.
Thank you for that. Ilya, turning towards you, how do Ukrainians react once they've been liberated from Russian occupation?
I visited Balaklia several days after it was liberated from Russia, and also villages close to that city. The general reaction is the feeling of, it was about relief and silent joy through tears. Many people cry. Many people say their blessings towards Ukrainian soldiers, because to them, all those months under Russian occupation was life in absolutely lawless and unpredictable environment. Because basically what they say is that Russian soldiers, especially when it comes to cities and towns close to the front lines, so they could come to anyone under any reason to do anything, absolutely anything. And there is nothing that stops them from doing anything, what they please. So that was the time for them during which absolutely no one is safe. So it's time for relief. Definitely people are happy about this, even in those locations where we did not see any major war crimes, but still things like robbing, intimidation, interrogations, daily interrogations were very widespread and very normal in those areas. So of course, when the normal life gets back, everybody is very happy and feel very relieved.
Can only imagine. And Petro, turning to you, what is similar to previous referenda carried out by Russia and its proxies, and how is this different?
Sorry, yes. Hi. I think that in her first words, Natalia already said that it was no difference. And what we are seeing right now is the consequences of the fact that in 2014, many in the West, including people from establishment, including people from major political parties, if we speak about the United States, they just accepted the fact, despite all of the formal statements, that it's not acceptable, it will not be recognized. But on a political level, it was accepted that Russia has actually the right to do this, despite the fact how it was done. And the word referendum sounded for the first time in 2014. Nobody in the major Western media objected that such kind of a word, which describes a democratic procedure, a direct voting on key issues of the national life, that this word cannot be used to describe what's happening in Crimea. So in the essence, and I will be very brief, there is, I would say, several, maybe three key major characteristics of what was in Crimea and what happens today in the occupied territories. First of all, Russians are doing this on the territory of the foreign state. So neither Crimea in 2014 and now, and neither Kherson, Zaporizhia, or Donetsk and Luhansk regions, they are Russian territories. So there are some examples in history. Then the states exchange with each other the territories, or the state was divided into two in a peaceful way, like Czechoslovakia decided to split up into two states, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And can we imagine that the Czech Republic announces to hold a referendum in Bratislava and trying to assist with sending there an army? Moreover, if we remember that nothing like this happened in Germany in 1990, when the Eastern Germany, there was a reunification between Eastern Germany and the West Germany. So it was in a peaceful way. It was the result of the revolution. But what Russia is has tried to pretend in 2014 that the Crimea referendum was a result of kind of popular uprising. But this uprising was assisted by the formidable military force. Moreover, it was assisted by the defectors and traitors, Ukrainian traitors, who switched the sides and who became the new officers of the security services and the Russian army. And that all helped to conduct this kind of, I would say, balloting, maybe, or waste recycling balloting in Crimea. So the same is going on today. So first, it happens on the territory of the sovereign nation occupied by the neighboring nation. Secondly, it's done by force and by intimidation, as Natalia described. And thirdly, it has nothing common with the standards of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Despite the fact that Russia is a member of the OSCE, it violates the standards not only in the occupied territories, but also inside. So my question is to the Western media, how you can use the words referendum, voting, elections in a state where there are no free and fair elections and referenda for many years.
Natalia, if I may, I'd like to return to a topic that you mentioned a few minutes ago, which is filtration. Would you mind explaining to our audience a little bit more about what that really means? It's a very benign term in English, and that really doesn't capture what the actual process looks like.
So yeah, the term is in fact not new. It's new to Ukraine. The term was used still in Chechnya by the Russian troops in the 90s. So the idea is that any person in Chechnya, it was done in the 90s when, for instance, there are people in the village or the town want to leave the area, there would be the background check. But if there is something wrong with the person, or there is a suspicion, the person might go to a prison, which is arbitrary, would be the detention. Now, you might know there is this famous, already infamous Olenivka prison, for instance, in the occupied Donbass. So there are the people which had been tortured, beaten, and who disappeared. So basically, since the start of the this phase of the invasion, like we know about the attack on Mariupol, people who wanted to leave, they would need to go through this background check. And at first, so for instance, the families would be separated. There would be, kids sometimes left without their fathers, or sons would be taken. And then, people are stripped of anything, like their clothes, their telephones. The problem is that, again, I would really probably need to clarify that I do report on the ground for all these years, for all these months now. And I also work, the Reckoning Project, we work also is documenting the alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. So we very much in details follow the stories, talk to the people, track some of the cases. And in my team, there are the journalists who are from occupied areas, who, left occupied areas. So my talks are based on the numerous, evidence. So we had the cases when people were just stopped for, as I said earlier, suspected of being not loyal to the Russian state. And we understand that any Ukrainian is potentially not loyal. A wrong registration, again, like a tattoo, or just somebody who is suspicious. The problem that we know the stories about people who went to concentration. We know less about the people who might not know. It's also a very humiliating procedure, but what is also important, that was a major obstacle for quite a long time. People who wanted to leave the occupied areas, newly occupied areas in the south, if they really tried to do that in spring, and for instance, if the volunteers were bringing them, there were numerous cases when the private cars were shot, but later the road was just shut down. There was no other way. So now, for instance, people from Kherson region, they were able to go to occupied Crimea or to Russia. And for quite a few people, it's a risky thing, because if you are a man, you better not do this. Thus, that partially make quite a few people stay in this area instead of leaving. That's why it's also very cautious, why we are so cautious and worried about the, how they would force these people to, vote with the guns near their heads.
Thank you. Ilya, I'm going to ask you a difficult question. What is Putin's strategy here? What does he accomplish by holding this media exercise disguised as a vote?
Well, I believe that basically what we're seeing since September 21st, the scam referenda and also this mobilization effort, is basically the sign of desperation, probably in the Kremlin, because what they are doing right now and the way they are doing this tells me a lot about the fact that the situation in the front line, particularly in Donbass, might be even worse than what we expect. So why they do this? Of course, the result was predestined from the beginning. That's obvious to absolutely anyone, including Russians themselves, of course. What they're doing is that, from my personal perspective, they do this out of two reasons. First reason is that they want to proclaim these territories as legitimate Russian territory. And on these grounds, they might proclaim martial law inside Russia under pretext of, protecting Russian sovereign territory, as they call it, as they would disguise it. So that's mostly about the martial law, the juridical reasons for martial law. But also, starting from October the 1st, what Russia is having is the new cycle of conscription in its military systems. It's pretty cyclic. So this might be also a pretext for mobilizing conscripts in the newly occupied Ukrainian territory as conscripts in masses. So I believe that's two reasons. Martial law for Russia with all of its limitations, and also possibly conscripts. And besides, we should not forget about the fact that there is a possibility of Russia adhering to nuclear intimidation, nuclear blackmail of Ukraine. For instance, they can issue a threat of using a nuclear weapon against Ukraine weekly or daily until Ukraine basically comes down with the ultimatum on something from the Russian side. So that's also a possibility against this, but it's the lowest possibility of this.
Thank you. And Petro, over to you. What's at stake for Ukraine? What Ukrainian perspective do you want included in the conversation about these so-called referenda?
First, I think I do not understand the question you asked.
So what do you think are the risks for Ukraine? What's the what's Ukraine risking, and also what do you want the rest of the world to keep in mind when they're thinking about what's actually happening?
Okay, thank you. A very good question. That it shows that we still are in different realities. I mean, Ukraine and the Western countries. When you look at the Russian actions, you try to see it from the rational perspective, so that it's a kind of a new phase or a new stage in Putin's actions. You see, I don't think that the war will change significantly for two reasons. First, of course, these referendums has two main audience, and Ukrainians are neither. First major audience is the West. Audience wants to persuade you that after he proclaims that these territories are Russian territories, that the threats for you for helping Ukraine will grow a lot, that these territories are protected by the nuclear weapons, and therefore the risk of the nuclear war increases. Well, that's the first reason, and I'll explain why you shouldn't be afraid of this. Secondly, of course, the second major audience of what they are doing in the occupied territories several days ago and today is the Russians. As you know, and many Russians do know, that the war is going out of the plan, that it's not developing correctly, and the victory is far away, despite all the official propaganda. But when you declare that these territories are annexed and these new territories and the territory of Russia actually enlarges, that is a fact or a kind of fact that you can present as a victory. So if you gain more territory, you are victorious in a very simple way. You can say that Ukrainians are losing and we are winning. So Russia is increasing in territory. Many are coming back to their homeland, as they call it. And so history is on our side. That's the message that Putin wants to say. And of course, he is trying to portray himself as the kind of, second edition of Joseph Stalin or Peter the Great, those leaders of Russian Empire or Soviet Union that succeeded in enlarging of the state. And that's enlarging territory is a kind of equal to enlarging the grandeur, the power and the greatness of the state. Speaking about the war and about the nuclear threat, yes, it's possible, but there is a kind of contradiction. First, if you are victorious, why should you use the ultimate weapon, which changes everything? And Russians and Putin himself and their elites, they do know that it changes everything, that Russia would be completely isolated and would become a pariah state. That's clear for them very well. And secondly, they also observe the consequences of the so-called partial mobilization. Many people are leaving the country. So if I say that they would use the nuclear weapon, I think that would, in some segments of Russian society, there will be a lot of joy. So finally, we will show everybody that we are so strong and we are the top nation. But believe me, as most people who are afraid of war, they will be afraid of the nuclear war too, and they will be terrified. So the social consequences will be too great to risk the stability of the regime. So I think it's, actually, the baseline, nothing will change significantly. The war will go on, but it will depend on whether Ukraine will obtain more weapons to defend itself and to recover these territories.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, it's really striking to hear that there's a certain segment of the population that would actually welcome the prospect of nuclear war. And I'd like to turn to a message from the chat. We have a question from Philippe. Is it possible that annexation could be the first step of an effort to freeze the conflict on Putin's part? Natalia, would you like to answer that one?
No, yeah, I probably can, because I'm pretty surprised by that. No, I mean, there is nothing vice versa. You know, if there would be the question, if there is any prospect for negotiation or something. So grabbing somebody's territory is really just the opposite side, especially after the these heavy losses that the Russian army had in northern region of Ukraine, in Kharkiv, within this successful country offense. So really finding the way and not doing that would be the sign. This one is just absolutely opposite. So for me, it's also very important to read this sign. If it was initial question, if geopolitically it matters. So in fact, it matters to the Western audience to understand that this shows that the Kremlin has no at all any will to negotiate. And the President Zelensky also expressed that, saying that he told a few times that this is a critical another red line, but still a red line for Ukraine to not to deal with that. And just shortly mention, what is a tragic in the whole thing. Like the Russians have no idea what are these places are. If you really listen to the, like leaked or wires or the calls of the Russian soldiers, they are unable to pronounce the name of those towns. They are totally far away, distant. So really, it's not an irony; it's a whole tragedy of this war. But if you're really speaking now about the annexation, those small towns whose names tells nothing to most of the people globally, apart from the Ukrainians, also mean nothing to the Russian public, to be honest. So it's all very kind of vague idea of the imperial power. Would it be a different military, terrain, and would be not this town, but that town, that would be the same. It really has no connection to what really the local population think.
Yeah, and jumping off of that point, Ilya, we've seen suggestions that Ukraine should negotiate and possibly even cede territory to end this war. How does the Ukrainian public assess these suggestions?
Well, I can only quote one of the recent polls saying that close to 90% of Ukrainian population are absolutely against any sort of territorial concessions for the sake of any size, any sort of agreement with Russia. So that's your simple answer to what the Ukrainian population thinking about concessions for peace. Because, of course, given what we are seeing right now in the front line, the morale is very high, of course. The Ukrainian public is rejoicing, I would say. So yeah, Russia is now absolutely not in a position to demand any sort of territorial concessions for peace. And the funniest thing here is that everybody understands this right now at this point, not after the Kharkiv counteroffensive action, not after what we are seeing right now in Liman, for instance. Russia is not in a position, and those advocating this deal with the devil the easiest way also know this, but they still go and insist on this. If you ask me, the only possible way for Ukraine, the only acceptable way for Ukraine and for everybody in the world when it comes to preventing yet another war is inflicting a military defeat in Russia. And by saying a military defeat, I mean that Russia must be denied of its ability to go on waging this war in this very moment, in the foreseeable future. And then Ukraine must go on developing itself as a military power to prevent yet another attack of such kind. So that's the only possible and realistic way to truly end this war and to prevent yet another round of this war within 2 years, let's say. Not really a choice.
And Ilya, we have another question from the chat, and this one is quite specific from Luke Harding. How much territory can Ukraine take back this year in its southern and eastern counteroffensive?
Well, it's a tricky question because the formula includes so many unknown things that are very hard to predict. So let's talk about in general terms. I think what we Ukrainian military is doing is trying to get to a place that is the best we can get to from the strategic point of view by wintertime, by rainy season, by wintertime. I think realistically we can expect huge Ukrainian successes in Luhansk Oblast. I think that's the perspective of the nearest weeks, and possibly Kherson. That sounds realistic, a bit optimistic, but realistic, pretty realistic. So just to summarize, I think it's a huge part of the vast territory under Russian occupation, and possibly Kherson by winter time. Because when winter comes, of course, hostilities would continue. But I think that will not be seeing substantial progress, because that's going to be like a war of logistics, the war of sustainability between the two sides, without major territorial gains on both sides. Fresh territorial gains, I think, would be seen on the spring campaign following this war of logistics. So large parts of Donbass and possibly Kherson.
Great, thank you. And Petro, our last question for you. Based on your experience since 2014, how likely is it that concessions would deter future Russian aggression against Ukraine?
Well, you see, since you mentioned 2013, the history shows that even if we count from 2014, that territorial concession did not change the dynamics of the conflict. Russia used territory of occupied Crimea and territories inside the Donetsk and Luhansk regions to prepare this kind of full-scale attack. Since 2015 to 2020, every year, every month, Russian troops had been training in Crimea, near Ukrainian borders, and in the occupied territories of Luhansk and Donetsk region. They were training and they were rehearsing the offensive. Together with Belarus, for the last 5-6 years, they had been rehearsing attack from the north to Kiev. So you see, the goal, Putin's goal, is not to take more territories. The goal is to destroy Ukraine as a state, and that's pretty clear. If we can only imagine hypothetically that he orders a ceasefire, and he'll also hypothetically succeeded in imposing this ceasefire on Ukraine, it means that only in the next 12 or 18 months, there will be no long period of peace. In the next 12, 18 months, they will learn all the lessons of this campaign, and they will restart the war. So, and the new war after this ceasefire would be even more disastrous, not only for Ukraine, but also for all of the countries that supported Ukraine, because in the new war, the top priority of Russian army would be to cut off the lines of supply to Ukraine and to intimidate the West in a manner that the West would not would be discouraged to help Ukraine. So that means that today it's the moment when Ukraine, together with the West, should defeat the Putin, regardless any kind of proposals, public, private, or secret, regardless all the proposals through different diplomatic channels to stop the war and to speak about the concession and so on and so forth, because that would be only a very, very brief respite before the new war.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank all of our panelists today. We are now going to transition into breakout rooms. So this is your chance to have one-on-one interactions with our panelists and ask your questions directly. Each panelist will be joining their own breakout room. So please go ahead and look at the icon at the bottom of your screen for breakout rooms and select the one that you would like to join. We will help you if you're having difficulty doing that. And we really appreciate you coming today to be part of this very important conversation. So thank you very much.